Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Reza Aslan, a writer, commentator, professor, and scholar of religions. He's the author of No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, Beyond Fundamentalism, and most recently, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. He is also the editor of the groundbreaking literary anthology Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. Aslan is the executive producer of the talk show Rough Draft with Reza Aslan, the ABC drama of Kings and Prophets, and CNN's upcoming documentary series Believer. In 2006, he co-founded Boom Gen Studios, a transmedia storytelling company that promotes entertainment relating to the people and cultures of the greater Middle East. As part of the 2016-17 Humanities series, the Oregon Humanities Center presented An Evening with Reza Aslan, Religion, Identity, and the Future of America on October 18th, 2016. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
You have a BA in Religious Studies from Santa Clara University, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard, and a PhD in the Sociology of Religions from UC Santa Barbara. What led to your scholarly interest in religions?
I've been interested in religion really ever since I was a child. I grew up in Iran, left at the revolution, and I think my childhood experiences of revolutionary Iran really gave me a sense of the power that religion has to transform societies for good and for bad. And it never left me. I always grew up very interested in religion, religious history, spirituality, religious phenomenology, despite the fact that I didn't actually grow up in a very religious family myself. When I was in high school, I joined an evangelical youth group and heard the gospel story for the first time and converted to a particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity. But I would sit, in church, or I would sit during Bible studies, and I would hear things that the leaders or the preacher was saying, and unlike everybody else, I would actually, check, go home and actually look it up, and realized more often than not that what I was being told was either just flat out incorrect or could be understood in multiple ways, and that really gave me this interest in studying the scripture and the history and the context. And I originally went to university in order to study English and to become a writer. But I thought, well, I'll just take some religion classes because I enjoy them, and just fell in love with the discipline, and kind of have been doing both things ever since.
I'm a literature professor, so I was especially interested to learn about your favorite passage in literature and its significance in your life. So do you mind telling us about that?
Right. So I imagine you're speaking about Fyodor Dostoevsky's masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov. And of course, embedded within that great work of literature is this little story that one of the characters, Ivan, tells one of the other characters called the Grand Inquisitor. And I think many people are familiar with this story, or should be familiar if they're not. It's essentially a fable about during the Inquisition, Jesus shows up on earth, he's immediately arrested, and he has an interview with the Grand Inquisitor, who in an astonishing speech essentially tells him that you're not needed anymore, that, thanks for everything that you've done, but, it's time for you to go away, and we'll take it from here. And then, of course, there's this really wonderful moment at the end of it where Jesus stands up, kisses the Grand Inquisitor, and walks out. And for me, I think I read that when I was 16 years old. And first and foremost, that is the book that made me realize that I wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was the moment when I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But that story itself, I think, really gave me an understanding, a real appreciation of the difference between a founder of a religion and the religion itself, which I think is a phenomenon that rings true regardless of what religion you're talking about. That, as I often say, religions are man-made institutions, and so since they are man-made, they are full of all the problems and attributes that human beings have, and most especially the desire for power and the way in which power can corrupt. And that, I think, was, in this wonderful allegorical way, the first experience that I ever had of it.
What do you, I mean, you've begun to draw a distinction between faith and religion. Just elaborate that a little
Very
more.
important distinction, and I think one that gets lost a lot. Faith and religion are not the same thing. Faith is ineffable, it's mysterious, it's highly individualistic. Religion is the language that one uses to express faith. It's a language made up of symbols and metaphors. It's a means through which an individual can communicate the almost inexpressible experience of faith to other people who understand the language. And I think that, unfortunately, what happens is that because we confuse the metaphor for the thing itself, because we confuse the symbol for the thing itself, not recognizing that whatever religious tradition you are referring to is nothing more than a way of expressing what is a universal experience. What faith is a universal experience. Then too often we get bogged down in these irreconcilable differences between religious traditions. I often use the metaphor of, if you have a French speaker and a German speaker and an English speaker, they probably wouldn't understand each other. But what's remarkable is that if I were a linguist and I understood all three of them, I would very quickly realize that they were saying the exact same thing. And that's very much the same thing when it comes to religion. I would say if there's just one thing that I would like people to understand, that would be it, is don't confuse faith for religion.
Another opposition or dichotomy or polarity that you talk a lot about is the relationship between religion and identity. And this obviously flows out of what you just said. For you, that's also a really crucial thing for us to understand, a crucial
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that when someone identifies with a religion, when someone makes a kind of faith statement, such as I am a Christian, or I am a Muslim, or I am a Jew, they are more often making a statement that is less about what they believe, less about their beliefs and practices, than about who they are, how they understand themselves. It is ultimately an identity statement. And as an identity statement, of course, it encompasses all the other aspects of a person's identity, be it their nationality, their ethnicity, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their politics, their social views, their class. All of these markers of identity are what make an individual, and religion is one of those things. But to think that religion exists in a vacuum, unaffected by those other aspects of one's religion, is frankly absurd. There's a reason why you can have two people go to the exact same scripture and come away with two radically opposed interpretations of it. The scripture hasn't changed. It's that the individual, him or herself, becomes the lens through which they can understand and interpret their religion, their faith, their scripture. And I think, again, for a lot of people, they believe that the founding issue of religion, when someone makes a religious statement, that really that's about how they associate themselves with orthodoxy, or how they associate themselves with institutions. And by the way, I would say that the people who make this mistake the most are the non-religious community, the sort of more kind of extreme or radical atheist community that simply associates, the orthodoxy of a temple or the orthodoxy of an institution with the lived religious experience of an individual who happens to share the same religion. And I think that too is a fundamental flaw in the way that we think about not just religion but religious people.
So let's pursue that a little bit. This particular kind of contemporary atheism, you call it anti-theism. It's a kind of extremist or fundamentalist atheism. What do they get wrong in your view? What's the problem with that posture, that perspective?
Well, let me explain why I call it anti-theism and not atheism. Atheism, of course, is as old as theism. I mean, you can trace the concept of a lack of belief in a god or gods going all the way back to the Rig Veda, which was written, 1500 BC. So that's a long time, that the concept of a lack of belief in a God or gods has existed. And certainly some of my most influential thinkers, the people who have, I think, influenced me the most when it comes to the way that I think and write about religion, were themselves atheists, be it Feuerbach or Schopenhauer or Hegel or any of these sort of great thinkers of religion. That's different than this new phenomenon that really traces itself to the post-Enlightenment period, but has had a resurgence over the last 2 or 3 decades. This group, which often refers to itself as neo or new atheists, for them, it's not about not believing in God. It's about seeing religion as an insidious evil that has to be forcibly rooted out of society. That's not atheism, that's anti-theism. And it needs to be labeled as such. There was a wonderful study that came out of, I believe it was Duke University, I may be wrong about that, in which it was a widespread study on atheism in America, and it found that only 15% of American atheists actually associate with anti-theism. But because of these very loud ideologues who are, take up the bestseller lists and make a lot of noise on television, it would, I think for a lot of people, they think that that is the face of atheism, and it simply is not the case in the United States. I have no problem with atheism at all. It's actually quite a rational decision when confronted with the question of whether there is something beyond the material realm or not. There is no proof one way or another, and so if you believe that there isn't, that's a perfectly sound and reasonable response. The problem that I have with anti-theism, however, is that it ascribes certain attributes to religion in a very straw man argument way that simply do not exist. One of which is that the sort of mainstream understanding of a religious text or of any kind of religious experience is fundamentally the extreme voices. So for instance, Sam Harris quite famously says that those who do not read the scripture literally or inerrantly are actually not reading it in the correct way, that moderate Christians or liberal Muslims are actually providing cover for extreme forms of religiosity, rather than recognizing religion for what it is, which is, as I said earlier, the lived experience of individuals negotiating their place in the world and coming up with a fundamentally different answer to the question, is there something beyond the material realm?
We're in a moment, and you've talked about this repeatedly, where modes of fundamentalist or extremist belief, and I mean whether those are modes of fundamentalist extremist religious belief or anti-religious belief, are widespread. What do you think is the cause of that trend? Why is it that extremisms are so common now?
I think we have to begin with an understanding of what fundamentalism actually is. Fundamentalism is not an independent phenomenon. It's a reactionary phenomenon. It always has been a reactionary phenomenon. Indeed, the very term fundamentalism arose at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, specifically to refer to a group of conservative Protestant, mostly American Christians, who were reacting against both the scientific revolution, but also more importantly, reacting against liberal Christianity. That really became the primary response to the scientific revolution. The idea that we should read the scriptures in figurative terms and understand them in the context in which they were written, etc., etc. A group of very conservative Christians reacted to that by reverting to what they refer to as the fundamentals of their faith, and hence the term fundamentalism. Now that term, of course, has been broadened. It's expanded now to refer to all kinds of different groups and ideologies, but fundamentally what it means is that you are reacting to something, be it the natural progress of society, be it secularism, be it liberalism, whatever the case may be. And so it may seem somewhat an unsatisfying thing to say, but when I am confronted with what seems, at least on the surface, as a resurgence of fundamentalism around the world, both religious and political fundamentalism around the world, I always try to remind myself that if this is a reaction to something, then it's that something that is on the rise. Secularism, progress, liberalism throughout the world, these are the forces that, when you look at the broad horizon of history, are moving forward, inexorably moving forward throughout society. And there will always be people who will react against that, whether because they feel left behind or whether they feel threatened by those forces, whatever the case may be. So let's not focus on the reaction, let's focus on the thing that's being reacted to.
So let's talk about fundamentalism and anti-fundamentalisms in the Muslim world. So what are some of the forces that have led to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS? What are some of the things that those groups are reacting against?
It's a very good question, and before I answer it, I feel like what I need to do is separate the two different kinds of fundamentalism, because in the Muslim world, because they often get conflated. There is what is often referred to as the politically inspired nationalistic fundamentalism. This is what the term that we often use, Islamism, this notion of a reaction to the widespread secularism and nationalism that, although quite a new phenomenon in the Middle East, has become sort of the defining way of organizing oneself. You know, when we look at the countries of the Middle East, we are looking at countries that were often created by outsiders, often with fabricated nationalities and arbitrary borders, without really any attempt to create a kind of organic sense of national identity. And so most often what happens is that in order to supplant that identity, you need some kind of a top-down authoritarian structure. And so it's not a coincidence that you see, certainly over the last 60, 70 years, since the twilight of the colonialist period, these authoritarian states in the Middle East. Now, when confronted with that kind of governmental social structure, it only makes sense that you are going to have people who rise up against it by looking to another source of identity, some other means of creating a collective sense without necessarily using nationalism, and so religion becomes that sense. That's different than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We cannot confuse Hezbollah with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We can't confuse Hamas with ISIS and we can't even confuse Taliban with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. These are fundamentally different functions. One is an Islamist organization, nationally inclined. One is a global organization. We refer to this as jihadist. Here is the main difference, is that when you look at a group like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these are not anti-modern groups. They are not rejecting modernity. They are not rejecting technological advances. They're not rejecting even globalization. On the contrary, they are the children of globalization. They are, for the most part, well-educated, fairly sophisticated, not poor, mainly middle class. They have a fundamental view of the world that is at odds with our current sort of sense of identities, nationalist identities. They want to see a world that's one sort of totality under their control, without borders, without nationalities. And so that is, I think, if we're going to deal with the problem, the very real problem of religious fundamentalism in Islam, we need to label it correctly first.
And in contradistinction to Hezbollah, those you see as having a much more local, political, national agenda?
Absolutely, yes. Hamas is interested in Palestine. Hezbollah is interested in Lebanon. The Taliban, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, which is why we always have to separate the two, these are nationalist organizations with nationalist agendas. They want something real and something concrete. Now, they may not be able to have those things, we may not allow those things, but there is a fundamental difference. If you want something that's real and measurable, there is room for negotiation. There is room for moderation. The difference with a group like that and a transnational organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda is that what they want is imaginary. What they want is not real or concrete. They're not interested in land or territory. They're not interested in statecraft. What they want is to reconstitute the global order under their control. That is an impossible task. And so that makes negotiation, compromise, moderation nearly impossible.
So what are the alternatives? I mean, I'm sure there are many people who would say, well, what we're doing now isn't addressing that adequately.
It's very true.
What do we do? What can we do?
Well, let me be clear. Those militants and fighters that belong to these transnational organizations that have taken up arms and that are, in the case of ISIS, engaged in what can only be described as ethnic cleansing, as a genocide, must be hunted down and destroyed. There is no other option with the fighters on the ground. But these are movements that are much larger than just their fighters. The ideology that fuels these few thousand, couple of thousand individuals who are actually taking up arms is, I think, a much trickier thing. And, you know, to put it in its simplest way possible, what we have discovered over the last 50, 60 years is that when religious opposition is given an opportunity to take part in the free marketplace of ideas, when it is given room to take part in the political conversation and even elections, it, without exception, moderates itself. We've seen this, frankly, with Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is a terror organization, but it's also a political party. And if you look at Hezbollah in 2016 and compare it to Hezbollah in 1996 or even 1986, these are two vastly different organizations. The difference between the Hezbollah of today and the Hezbollah of the past is that the Hezbollah of today has a stake in the government of Lebanon. They are a political party. They have something to lose. And so they have, by necessity, had to moderate their behavior, had to moderate their ideologies. Are they still a problematic force in Lebanese politics? Absolutely. But are they responsible for the kind of global atrocities that we were experiencing, you know, at the hands of Hezbollah 10, 20 years ago? No.
So are you arguing for the expansion of modes of democracy in the Middle East? Is that the logic, the next step in your logic?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to understand that even when it comes to groups like Al-Qaeda, these are groups that were formed in the dank prison cells of Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria. These are groups that began with distinct nationalist agendas, but when those agendas were violently suppressed, it radicalized them. It forced them to start looking to global concerns, which cannot be addressed, as I said, instead of local concerns, which can.
So can we switch to the United States for a moment? Because I know that you're also a thoughtful and interesting illuminator of the kinds of extremisms and fundamentalisms that are present in the United States. We're in the midst of a presidential election. Most commentators say the most divisive, the most antagonistic, the most intolerant election in our time. How should we respond to these conditions, the presence of this kind of extreme political discourse and behavior in our country?
Well, this may not be a very popular thing to say, but what I would say is that what we are experiencing right now did not come out of nowhere. This has been a crisis of identity that has been brewing in the American electorate for 20 years, if not more. The fact of the matter is that this is a country whose racial landscape, whose political landscape is fundamentally different than it was even a generation ago. And indeed, demographers tell us that within a decade or more, we will become the first nation on earth to be majority minorities. Now, for many people, that is a reason to celebrate. It's what makes America so distinct, so unique. That extraordinary sense of what we are is defined precisely by the unity that we find in our diversity. But as I was saying before, when confronted with this kind of progress, there will always be people who, because they feel threatened, who, because they feel left behind, are going to react, sometimes violently, against that progress. I think what we've seen with Trumpism as an ideology is that there is a large swath of Americans who feel as though they are being left behind. And that's a real sentiment. I think too often we just simply ignore it, or we brush it aside, or we just simply shrug and say, too bad. There is no reversal of what's happening here. I think this fantasy that we can return to some imaginary time when everything was great in America is absurd. It's a false dream. But I will say that it's a very real fear, a very real concern, that despite the fact that it's being exploited for political gain, can't just simply be brushed under the rug, because if it continues to be so, then it can radicalize. You know, we're going to see what we've seen in other parts of the world.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, so this is going to be my last question. You're the father of 3 children. They're young.
Yes.
What gives you hope about the future as a father?
I think for me, even in my darkest times, and there have been some dark times over this last couple of months, let me tell you, what I always try to do is broaden my perspective. When I look at the world from a historical point of view, when I start seeing the progress of humanity not in terms of years, but in terms of decades and centuries, I feel, and I think it's impossible not to feel otherwise, that we are moving inexorably towards a more pluralistic, more peaceful, more tolerant world. And I think that with each generation, as we continue to fulfill that promise and to feed our values to our children, we are making that dream a greater reality.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end the interview. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. It was really fascinating.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with writer, commentator, professor, and scholar of religions, Reza Aslan, author of the bestsellers Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, and No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. As part of the 2016-17 Humanities series, the Oregon Humanities Center presented An Evening with Reza Aslan, Religion, Identity, and the Future of America on October 18th, 2016. Thanks so much for watching.